Some new sales data for Resident Evil Requiem just came out, and it raises a pretty big question about Sony's argument for moving away from physical games. Because when gamers were actually given the choice between physical and digital copies, the sales data doesn't exactly line up with the narrative that Sony's been pushing about why they're moving away from physical games. One of the biggest arguments we've heard for the industry moving away from physical games is that digital sales dominate the market. And when you look at some of the numbers that Sony reports and others report, that certainly appears to be true. Sony will tell you that 90% of their sales come from digital transactions, but I think there's a pretty big problem with using those numbers to determine whether gamers actually want physical games, because those digital numbers also include digital-only games that were never made available physically, as well as other in-game microtransactions. And so yes, Sony's revenue may be dominated by digital sales for that reason, but that doesn't exactly answer the question of, when players are given the choice between the same game in physical or digital formats, what version do people actually prefer and buy? And that's why some of this new sales data for Resident Evil Requiem is so interesting. Games Radar recently reported numbers from Ampere Analysis showing the physical versus digital split for Resident Evil Requiem in several major markets. And the numbers look very different from what you might expect. Let's go ahead and take a look at the article from Games Radar. There it is. Resident Evil Requiem is selling just as many physical copies as digital globally, with near 50% splits according to analysts. Except for in the United States, only 22% of their sales were physical. We'll circle back around to that. I think I can explain why the numbers in the United States were lower than other parts of the world. But let's continue on in the article. According to the game business co-founder Christopher Dring, as per statistics from Ampere Analysis, the split between physical and digital copies is far more significant in the United States than it is elsewhere. Like I said, we'll get back to that. Continuing on in the article, you could see this tweet from Christopher Dring. In the United States, just 22% of Resident Evil Requiem sales were physical to end the month of June, but it was over 55% physical in France, 51% in Japan, 43% in Australia, and 40% in the United Kingdom. This is according to Ampere. Not all markets are built the same when it comes to the digital transition. So in other parts of the world, it's actually closer to about a 50-50 split between physical and digital sales. But what about the United States? Why are their numbers so low? Well, if you remember when Resident Evil Requiem first came out, it was actually pretty difficult to find physical copies of that game for a while. It was sold out everywhere. Here you can see an article from IGN that was published at the time that Resident Evil Requiem launched, and it says Resident Evil Requiem is still almost entirely sold out online, with physical copies only available at select retailers. Amazon was the only retailer with stock online for the PlayStation 5. Physical copies of the highly anticipated Resident Evil Requiem are becoming increasingly difficult to come by online in the United States, with the game just about sold out everywhere on all platforms. And that wasn't just online where the game was sold out. For the first few weeks when this game came out, it was pretty hard to walk into a retail store and see a copy of the game sitting on the shelf for purchase. It just feels like Capcom underestimated the demand for the physical version of this game in the United States, and it was just really hard to come by both online and in retail stores. And that makes me wonder what the 22% number would have looked like in the United States if the physical inventory had actually been able to keep up with the demand. Because if you walked into a store looking for a physical copy and it wasn't there, you basically had two choices. Wait for it to come in stock, or buy it digitally and start playing the game immediately. And I'm sure there's at least some people that chose to buy it digitally when they found out that they couldn't buy a physical copy of the game both online or in a store. And this is the problem that I have, along with many others, on the digital versus physical sales and how they're often presented. Seeing that 90% of gaming revenue is digital doesn't necessarily mean that 90% of gamers would have chose the digital version over the physical version if both options were sitting in front of them. If a game only exists digitally, every sale is automatically counted as digital. If someone buys DLC, spends money inside of a game, that's also digital revenue. None of those purchases tell us whether that person would have chose a disc or a download when they're buying a $70 game. Resident Evil Requiem gives us a much clearer comparison. Same game, same customer, physical or digital. And in several markets all over the world, physical represented somewhere between 40 to 55% of those sales. That's a pretty significant difference from the picture we're usually shown by these companies. And to me, that's the important part of the story. I'm not trying to argue that digital isn't popular. Obviously it is. I'm not even trying to argue that physical games outsell digital games overall. They generally don't. But what I'm saying is that when gamers are actually given the choice between buying the same game physically or digitally, the gap between physical and digital might not be nearly as large as some of these overall numbers in the industry make it seem. And Resident Evil Requiem is a really good example of that. I really hope we continue to get more data like this. I don't just want to know how much money PlayStation makes in digital sales versus physical sales. We already know digital sales are enormous. I want to know what happens when somebody actually has a choice. Give me the same physical versus digital split for the same AAA game. Wolverine is going to be an interesting one to watch when that releases on the PlayStation 5, especially with all the attention its physical release has already been getting, with the announcement that the game will be fully playable from the disc. Because if we continue to see 40, 50%, or even more of those major releases being purchased physically in certain markets, it's going to become increasingly difficult to argue that consumers don't want physical games. Because based on the Resident Evil Requiem numbers, there are still a lot of people choosing physical games. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think the demand for physical games is actually much higher than the numbers Sony and other companies have been representing? Or do you think Resident Evil Requiem is an exception and the all-digital future is truly what most gamers want? I'd love to hear what you guys think. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you on the next one.